Over same-sex marriage. We've got this postal survey coming out. We've got a few people talking about campaigning for the yes side. On the no side, we have Liberal MP Kevin Andrews here in the studio with us. Thanks for your time today, Kevin.
My pleasure.
Can I start with a few contributions made so far in the no area, if you like, that talk about concern about children in families? That's not actually what this plebiscite or postal survey is about, though, is it?
Well, ultimately, the plebiscite or the postal vote is about what is the legal definition or meaning of marriage. And the traditional meaning has been that it's an institution that the law has some say in, because not all relationships the law has a say about at all. I mean, we have relationships, friendships, affections. The law has no place in relation to that. So traditionally, across cultures and civilisations, it's been the protection of people who are vulnerable from a relationship, and they tend to be, in particular, children, but certainly in some cultures, women included.
The children are already allowed in with same-sex couples. Nothing actually changes, does it, with this vote in that regard?
Well, what we know from decades of social science research is that the best environment for raising children, the optimal environment for raising children, is having two loving parents, a man and a woman, a husband and wife, in a stable relationship. Now, it doesn't mean that other relationships aren't able to be successful for children, but overwhelmingly the social science research points to that being the optimal situation.
But even if that's accepted, I know people out there dispute some of it, and there are different studies done in different parts of the world. Again, this doesn't actually change that. Wouldn't this even help, that same-sex couples can already have children in their families? This way they have a more stable environment via marriage.
Well, again, there's an input from both a husband and a wife, from a mother and a father. Now, as I said, optimally, you've got the input from both, and the children brought up in those circumstances as a cohort are better off than those who are not. Again, I'm stressing that I'm not saying that children in some circumstances...
There'd be a lot of people, though, that would dispute that. So just take us through the research. What are the sort of longitudinal studies that say that you are better off in a family where there is a mum and a dad, as opposed to a single parent or a mum and a mum or a dad and a dad, keeping in mind that, you know, we've got a big problem with domestic violence in Australia. There are some people in relationships with a mum and dad where dad's beating up the mum.
That's true. So what we're talking about is the overall situation. Again, let me stress at the outset, it doesn't mean that a child brought up in a single-parent family where often it's a mother, but it can be a father, are doing a really heroic job in raising that child. But as you know, I wrote a book of 500 pages with hundreds of footnotes and referenced thousands of social science studies on this. And quite clearly what they show is that there is particular input from fathers, there's particular input from mothers, and both of those optimally are valuable for a child. So whether it's in terms of health outcomes, mental health, physical health, whether it's in terms of employment prospects, in terms of how this is generated from one generation to another, the social science evidence is overwhelmingly in one direction in this regard. And there are literally hundreds of studies that show that.
So don't you think you're saying that people that come from families that are either single parents or same-sex couples are second best?
No, not at all. I think we can acknowledge, as I have even here this morning, a number of times, that people do the very best they can, often in very difficult circumstances, but what is optimal in this regard? Having said that, I don't think this is the core of the issue in relation to the same-sex marriage debate, but I'm trying to frankly answer your question.
Fair enough. You've also said, though, that you think that same-sex marriage could open the door in some ways to group relationships, or are you talking about polygamy there? What are you actually saying?
Well, once you change the definition from a man and a woman, which has traditionally been held, and say that it can be between two individuals, well then any set of arrangements can be put in place, because after all it's only, I suppose, a belief and emotion about a particular arrangement then applies, rather than what's traditionally been the case. Is it only, superstition that we then keep this arrangement to any two particular individuals? So once you change the boundary, the question is, where do you, with any sort of logic, draw that boundary again? And
but there's nothing in this proposed legislation that would open the door for people to have multiple wives or husbands, is there?
No, I'm not suggesting that for a moment, Samantha. But what in a world in which what is being advocated increasingly through things like the Safe Schools program, etc., about there being neutrality or fluidity in relation to the way in which people identify with different genders, well then this is a pathway which will lead to anybody claiming whatever gender they like, if it's just two people, being able to legally married in a relationship. And I think we should just accept that as whether you agree with it or not. That's where we're going.
You've described this as at the end of a self-imposed exile. You've been quiet for a while. Is this the issue that has forced you to take a greater stand, or is there a reason why you've taken a bit of a break from sort of more overt public discussion? Well,
for a while there, Samantha, everything that I said was commented on in the prism of the previous leadership situation within the Liberal Party. Even if I didn't say something, there were people writing about what I didn't say within that context, and I wasn't seeking to add to any sense of insecurity on the part of the coalition in that regard, so I decided that I would be much more circumspect in what I said. Having said that, though, this is a major issue. This goes to the very direction of society. It changes what's been an understanding for millennia, not just in our civilisation but most other civilisations, and I believe that I should speak out on it. I know a lot of my constituents want me to speak out on it, and I will.
Just on the change itself, so going back to the children element, because it's been introduced by other advocates out there, if you've got the law as it stands now, same-sex couples can have children, and the law as it stands after, they still will be able to, but with a marriage, do you think that makes that relationship perhaps a little bit more sturdy?
The way I would put it is this, that what we have is an understanding of marriage at the present time which says that the law has a place to play because of the protection of vulnerable individuals. They are often children, but they can be parties to the marriage itself. What we're doing is saying, let's change that understanding of marriage and say that marriage is now the recognition of an affectionate, committed relationship for the gratification of individuals. It takes away the emphasis, in my view, from the children themselves to the self-fulfilment of the adults in the relationship.
But why would it be, if it's same-sex talking about gratification and male and female talking about an institution? Aren't both sides looking for the same gratification? For
well, I think it comes back, as I said, to what is your meaning or understanding of marriage itself. Yes, there are all sorts of affectionate relationships. I have an affectionate relationship with you, Sam, but that's not the same. No, that's right. We're not married, right? I have an affectionate relationship.
You've got a very lovely wife.
I have an affectionate relationship with my cycling mates who we go cycling on the weekends, but that's not marriage. Why doesn't the law have a place in those sort of relationships? It doesn't, because the law has a place traditionally, historically, across cultures and civilisations, because it's there about the protection of the vulnerable.
Are you saying that you
shouldn't go beyond that?
Are you saying that you don't feel same-sex couples have the same depth of relationship?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
I mean, you're comparing the same-sex, though, to someone who goes cycling with someone on the weekend or is merely friends. These are people that are going to get married. Presumably, this is a lifelong commitment. You've got a colleague such as Tim Wilson who would say he's just committed to his partner as many other parliamentarians are to their, spouses.
Yeah, that's fine. And I have commitments to friends. I have affectionate relationships with friends as well. The question here is, what is the role of the law?
Tim Wilson's partner isn't his friend.
No, well, I hope he's his friend, as well as his partner, if you understand what I'm saying. The question is, where do you draw the boundary around what we understand as marriage? What normative influence does that then have on the rest of society? And what are the consequences of this? Now, we haven't spoken at all about the consequences this morning. There's been a debate about religious freedom, which is hardly protected at all in Australia. So there are all these aspects that really need to be looked into quite carefully before we decide to make a change like we're proposing.
What are the consequences? I mean, the Archbishop of Sydney has raised concerns that it could lead to restrictions in what could be taught in schools. Do you think that is a serious risk?
Well, I'm chairing an parliamentary inquiry at the moment into freedom of religion and belief, And the evidence from the constitutional and legal experts so far is that there is very limited protection for religious freedom and belief in Australia. Section 116 of the Constitution only goes to preventing the establishment of a state religion. Article 18 of the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, which is about protection of religious freedom, has not been incorporated into domestic law in Australia, whereas Article 26, which goes to discrimination, has. So you immediately have got an imbalance in the domestic law in Australia. So as we see of these cases in Tasmania where pastors are being taken to the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal, there's no countervailing protection of religion and belief in relation to that. And then on top of that, the bills that we've seen drafted to date are very narrow in terms of what they actually protect by way of religious freedom. They go to the ceremony itself. But as you know, I was involved for many decades in providing marriage education programs. The bills don't go, for example, to religious institutions of whatever faith that might provide marriage counselling or marriage education. They don't go to welfare services. You've got a school, for example, a Jewish primary school in London, which was being threatened with deregistration if it doesn't teach these young primary school students about gender reassignment and such things. So these are all consequences, and as I said, very limited protection according to the experts that we've heard for religious freedom and belief in Australia.
All right, well, there's a lot more there, and we're going to talk to you again, so don't worry, we'll get to all the issues because there's a fair bit to unpack. But Kevin Andrews, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure.